Okay, let's get going. Again, welcome. I'm really happy to see everyone participating today. My name is Jan Willem Kappes. I'm the Director Business Development at Assaia, responsible for EMEA and Asia Pacific region. I will be the host of today's webinar. And today we will be speaking about enhancing the sustainability of your airport and airline operations through behavioral change. In my opinion, one of the most interesting topics because it kind of combines technology with behavioral analytics, and that is kind of combining man and machine, which I think is really a super interesting topic. Maybe about the webinar today. So we are A, streaming this live on YouTube. B, we are recording it. So you will be able to get the recording after the webinar. We will send you a link. Also, there will be a longer bio of every panelist at the end of this presentation, of this webinar. So when you have more questions about certain topics, please feel free to basically go to the back in the recording and check about the panelists. With me today, I may welcome Amber Harrison, Sustainability Advisor at Rook and Wren, my colleague Christiaan, Chief Customer Officer at Assaia, Doug Kreuzkamp from California, the CEO of Springshot, as well as Dan White from England, the CEO of Signol. Today we will start basically with Amber talking about the aviation sustainability landscape. This will be followed by Christiaan with the topic of you can't manage what you can't measure. Very interesting also about how you can get the data in order to then later on use it. That one will be followed by Doug. To act big, we need to think small, how the digital transformation of airport operations is creating a greener future. And then last, but definitely not least, Dan, about the sustainability through behavior change. So basically like wrapping it all together. And then in the end, there will be a possibility for questions and answers. However, whenever you want to ask a question, please feel free. There is a Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. You can always ask questions throughout the webinar, and then at the end of the webinar, we will answer them. And now over to you, Amber, and I wish everyone a great webinar.
Thanks, Jan. So I'd like to start by taking a bigger picture look at aviation sustainability. If you're at the webinar in July around aircraft ground operations, you'll have heard that sustainability is a strategic concern for civil aviation. Now, despite the challenges that aviation's faced over the last 12 months and is likely to still face, sustainability is still a big issue. So on the next slide, you'll see the amount of emissions attributable to aviation currently varies depending on source, but it's generally around 2.5%. And even though the number of flights has decreased dramatically in the last year, it's anticipated that aviation's contribution to climate change will remain at similar levels. However, as ATAG, the Air Transport Action Group, noted, green recovery affords us an extraordinary opportunity for air travel. Now, while it might seem easy to make changes in other industries, the complex nature of aviation means that it can take longer to implement and to see the benefits of lasting change. Compared to electric vehicles, which have been around for a while, the infrastructure is here to support charging, and the general public can easily see what an electric car looks and sounds like. However, it's harder to see if a plane is using sustainable aviation fuel or if it's more fuel efficient. So to all intents and purposes, planes still look the same. So you can understand why there might be a perception that things aren't happening. But it's not the case. Progress has been made. Aviation is considered to be 54% more efficient than it was in 1990, based on the CO2 emissions per passenger kilometre. And that's down to improvements in technology and operations. But the plans for a carbon neutral or net zero future for aviation are a long way out. And looking at the timeline here, you'll see there are some ambitious goals. Boeing and Airbus have targets in the next 10 to 20 years for biofuel powered and climate neutral aircraft, while Rolls-Royce are aiming to be net zero. Norway is aiming to have all short-haul flights taking place in electric planes by 2040. And 2050 is a very popular year for targets, with the industry goal of net CO2 emissions to be half 2005 levels, net zero European aviation to be in place through improvements including aircraft and engine technology and improved air traffic management and aircraft ops, while ACI, Airport Council International's Europe's Net Zero 2050 pledge commits the whole European airport industry to eliminating the carbon footprint under its control by this date. Also in 2050, One World Alliance members have united with a collaborative approach towards net zero targets that includes efficiency measures and waste reductions. And other airlines have also stated their aims for carbon neutral or net zero goals along this timeline. Unsurprisingly, sustainable aviation fuels and market-based measures for carbon offsets play a big part in these goals. However, following the publication of the Waypoint 2050 report, which is an excellent read from ATAG that sets out the pathways to meet the industry's 2050 goal, the thinking indicates that the net zero ambition for global air transport may still be 40 to 45 years away, and it requires the right advances in technology and significant support from governments. So on the next slide, it's time to think, how do you correlate these very high level ambitions with what's happening today? 40 to 45 years is a long way away. Now, if you consider that around 91% of emissions are from the flight stages of a journey, then innovations for new aircraft design can undoubtedly help with lighter planes and more efficient flight, while air navigation and climate optimized routing will contribute to cleaner and more streamlined flight paths. SAF, sustainable aviation fuel, has potential for big impacts. So that's a lot of emissions that can be removed from aviation. But what about the emissions on the ground? So back in the July webinar again, the point was made that ground operations can consume between 5 to 10% of overall aviation fuel, and that inefficiencies are abundant across ops processes. Now, this isn't perhaps surprising, as the focus is very much on aircraft turnaround, safe and efficient operations, and disruption management. After all, the airport's a fast-paced, time-critical environment. On-time departures are key to avoiding those dreaded delays. Airport collaborative decision-making has already helped realise many operational benefits in a process driven by data analysis and sharing between stakeholders. But if you want to further emissions from ground reductions activity, where do you start? Data is still king and can be used to bring new insights, but it's key to understand if the right data is being collected, how it's being collected, and where from. But with technology like the Internet of Things, it should be easier, more timely, and more accurate now than ever before. Now, once you have that information, and there's likely to be a lot of it, where do you find those insights that you can exploit? And how do you encourage your teams on the ground to engage with them? One of the straightforward facts about people is that we like simplicity. We don't like hassle. Let's face it, sometimes our attention span is limited. So how do you meld this data with a desire to effect change to benefit sustainability? Well, it's important that we figure it out quickly. Think back to that net zero target that ACI set in Europe. Over 330 airports are actively engaged in reducing emissions, as are many airlines. And these demands are being passed on through supply chains who will be expected to play their part in contributing towards reduction goals. So moving on to the next slide, changing the context can help. If you shift the lens on operational activities to have a sustainability theme, then you have the opportunity to see things in a new light. We've already seen positive moves towards the use of electric ground power units to replace diesel and sustainable taxiing. The use of AI and machine learning for predictive analytics for airport and airline operations has been for a while, but there is much more room for that to grow. Other initiatives around efficiencies have included more precise fuel and water uplift, moving in-flight entertainment onto passengers' own devices, and adapting in-flight catering for less waste. And these all help to reduce the overall weight of the aircraft and result in less fuel being required and therefore less emissions. You can also see fuel benefits from dynamic routing and continuous descent patterns, while on-time departures and less waiting on the taxiway again equals less fuel use and less emissions, but also less pollution at the airport. And even areas like de-icing, only progressing a plane when there's the ability to send it directly to the runway for takeoff, can mean less use of de-icing agents, less runoff of those agents into the groundwater, and less impact on biodiversity. So it all adds up. But there's a common theme with all of these innovations. They're very process-oriented and they're not driven by behavioural change. So there's a need to link the two and to frame the end goal in a sustainability context. So how do you make it sustainable, relevant, tangible, and personal? So on the next slide, it's really about how you bring these things to the individuals. At the airport, you're seeing a change in demographics. You might see more younger people working at airports, those who are aware of environmental considerations, but who might not be clear on how they can relate this passion to their job. Some people might just be focused on getting the job done, and both are perfectly reasonable attitudes. So the key is to make any activity or requirement relevant, tangible, and personal. Now, back in the July webinar, the point was made that overcoming roadblocks and deploying the right levers for change is very much a team sport. So understanding how the desired actions impact not just you, but your team and your company can make a real difference. It also makes a difference knowing that these activities are related to daily tasks, but there needs to be credibility and an understanding that there's a clear linkage between what you're being asked to do and the possible outcomes, in this case, improving sustainability. Clear and relevant information is important to show that making and applying changes brings tangible results, and that impacts and outcomes are tracked and measurable. After all, everyone likes to know that they're making good progress in what they're doing. And finally, it's vital to make it personal. Ensuring that it's clear the role that each person has to play makes it easier to implement. Remember that point about us humans liking to keep things simple and not wanting any hassle? Got to keep it really, really easy to understand. But there's a positive note here too. By being clear about sustainability aims, you might find some hidden gems. People have great ideas who are enthused by what they see. So you need to make sure that there's a way for them to contribute. So lastly, on my last slide, really it's a question of how you make it even easier. Now, nudge theory or behavioral economics has been around for a while, and whether you realize it or not, you've probably already been the recipient of nudges to drive small changes in behavior, from being urged to reuse your towel at a hotel to being encouraged to recycle more. And we'll hear more about some great examples with the following speakers. Small nudges have the power to make big impacts, and one of the most famous examples was the addition of a fly printed onto the urinals at Amsterdam Schiphol Airport. It helped reduce mess and therefore significantly reduce cleaning costs. And it's a great example of a simple idea, easily implemented, and it requires very little effort to see big returns. So I happen to believe that if the industry takes the opportunity to find new ways to combine insights from data with a very personal approach to drive behavior change, for those involved in operations at airlines and airports, then we have the chance to make a positive impact for the long-term sustainability of aviation. And you'll have some fascinating insights from my following speakers. Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot, Amber. I really like your point about making it tangible and personal. And I think that's also something we see when you're in the software domain, that if you forget to get also the operational stuff into the whole project, then it will no longer be tangible and personal for them, and you face much more opposition. So thanks a lot. Next on is Christiaan. So you can't manage what you can't measure. Christiaan, floor is yours.
Thanks, Jan-Willem. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. So before we move from the sort of overall introduction that we just had from Amber to more insights about how behavior can actually help drive sustainability by Dan and Doug, I kind of want to squeeze in between, and we'll keep it short today, but I want to give you an idea on how data plays a role to kind of fuel this behavioral change that we're going to talk about. So if we move to the first slide, data is fundamental to influence behavior. And I particularly chose the word fundamental here because if you want to change behavior, it will all depend on, in which direction and from which point are you starting. So Peter Drucker was, one of the guys who laid the foundation for modern management. And he said, you can't manage what you can't measure. And I think he was very right about it. So a couple of things to think about is, what does success even look like? Where do you want to go? If you don't have any data or you're not measuring your outcomes, then how are you ever even going to define what success looks like? How successful are you at the moment? How are you currently doing versus the goals that you've set yourself? If you don't know these kind of things, then you don't know where to invest and where to focus. If you know these kind of things and you're coming up with initiatives to kind of influence behavior, influence sustainability, which of these initiatives are actually paying off, right? So what's your return on investment, and which ones are the ones being productive and should maybe, you know, be increased in size, and which initiatives are actually, you know, not paying off or even being counterproductive. So you also need to measure, you know, where you're going from where you started. And then also looping back to what Amber just told us, the human aspect is very important. And I think we're all aware of the fact that, you know, if you want to enhance human behavior and you want to see more of a specific human behavior, you need to reward that. So you need positive feedback loops in order to basically reward people who are doing the right thing. So as an introduction, you know, we very strongly believe that, you know, you need to have this data in order to be able to see where you stand, where you're gonna go, and how your actions are basically influencing the expected outcomes. Then a couple of examples that I want to show, because, you know, if we're thinking about data and airports and sustainability, it might still be a bit abstract. So what I did, I chose for 3 examples of data that we believe can actually help influence people's behavior in order to get to more sustainable outcomes. And the first one has to do with APU versus ground power unit usage. So obviously, you know, when an aircraft comes in, it's still using its auxiliary power unit, which supplies energy to the aircraft. And this APU can actually only be turned off at the moment when the aircraft is attached to the ground power unit. And when the aircraft is departing, it's the other way around. So, you know, as soon as they detach the GPU, the APU will already have to be on to supply power to the aircraft. Now, the APU is very inefficient, and actually, from all emissions on airports, on average, on the ground, 6% of all of that comes from aircrafts burning APUs. So that's quite a significant chunk of CO2 emissions that you know, we can potentially minimize if we can minimize the amount of time that, you know, aircrafts are running these APUs. So what you see on the left side is from an experiment where we've used a heat camera, and where you can actually see quite clearly that, you know, by the hot engine cone, that in this case the infrared camera can actually very clearly see that, you know, the APU is on. And on the right side, you can see a snapshot from our turnaround control product, where you can see that our computer vision product is actually correctly detecting when a GPU is being connected and disconnected by an agent. So these kind of information can then, you know, be ingredients for alerts, notifications, in order to guide staff and help staff to understand that, you know, they might forgot something, that they actually did something which they should have done. So, you know, valuable inputs to influence behavioral change related to APU usage. The next example has to do with ground service equipment and the data around ground service equipment, and, you know, who's doing what and when are they doing it. In our experience, most airports and airlines typically have limited availability on real-time information about these kind of things. And when the information is there, it's typically not very accurate. And the interesting part is the more granular the information gets, the more interesting insights you're going to find. And one example that I wanted to give here is, again, you can see an outtake from our turnaround control product, where you can see 2 events, fueler being on stand and fueler being connected. And the particular interest is here in the difference between the two, because once you start analyzing, you know, when does ground service equipment actually arrive to do what it's supposed to do, and how long is it waiting or idling before it can actually do what it's supposed to do, then you'll probably find some really interesting patterns where, you know, fuelers or caterers are actually waiting, running their engines, emitting CO2, because something is basically obstructing them from doing what they came for. So we found, for example, that typically when front loading an aircraft with a belt loader happens at the same time as catering and fueling, typically one of these will be waiting because there's typically not enough space towards the front starboard side of the aircraft to do all of these things at the same time. So once we get more visibility on that, we can, you know, basically better plan these activities, both upfront, but also in real time, trying to prevent these situations from happening, and therefore further reduce emissions from idling equipment, basically on the stand. The third and last example before we move on has actually to do with the planning of aircraft. And especially during these COVID times, when we're looking to reach sustainability goals, while at the same time also, of course, trying to limit costs and capital and operational expenditures. The key, especially for airlines, to address all these goals at the same time is actually aircraft flow. Because if we have an ideal aircraft flow, which means that an aircraft is not waiting, it's not idling, it's not zigzagging, it's not flying at a suboptimal height, it's not flying at a suboptimal speed, it actually has the most optimal and therefore also most sustainable, but also most cost efficient flight you can actually have. And currently there's a lot of things that are standing in the way of these sort of optimal aircraft flow, which all have to do with planning. Because once we, if we make the plan before the day of ops, everything obviously looks good because it's the way we designed the plan. But then as sort of operations kick in, the day of operation kicks in, things start to change. And, we might have to have an aircraft waiting or ask them to zigzag a flight pattern. And what we are saying is that, again, you can use data in order to get a predictive image of the future that allows you to prevent these situations from happening. And therefore, situations where you have aircraft queuing on the taxiways, or even worse, being in the air at suboptimal speeds, at suboptimal heights, flying zigzag or holding patterns, is something that you can prevent if you know upfront that there's a problem with capacity, because in that case you would actually hold the aircraft on the ground at the gate while it's not burning kerosene, emitting CO2. So that's also data about not what's happening right now, but data that can be used to predict the future state and location of an aircraft that will help you to create aircraft flow that is most efficient. So those are just a few examples. There's obviously more, but I just wanted to make it a little bit less abstract so everyone has an idea when we talk about what kind of data can actually be helped to fuel behavioral change, and what does more sustainable behavior in aviation mean. These are some examples, and yeah, handing it over to the next speaker to zoom in further on these kinds of cases. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so without any further ado, Doug, the floor is yours.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Jan Willem. Thanks also to Amber for setting the stage on this critical issue. And I want to thank Christiaan for sharing more about the mind-blowing opportunities really to capture incredibly relevant and granular data through cameras and sensors. Couldn't agree more, Christiaan. Data is fundamental here. So within the context of this existential issue, I will next explore how we take all that data and make it actionable for human beings, namely the men and women who serve in airport operation roles throughout the industry. So if you stick with me for about 12 minutes, I promise a really big payoff. You're going to come away feeling more confident in your ability to use small actions that you manage today to drive big gains in sustainability. And let's start by addressing the underlying root cause issue.
Time is
which we have on the screen here. As humans, we are the antithesis of digital. We are by definition analog creatures. We're illogical, right? We're ruled by emotion, and we do things that are often quite opposite to our very own interests. So how do we bridge this gap between the analog human being and the data-driven world of where we want to be? How do we get our airport operations colleagues to collect and use this data in a way that drives big change? Well, the answer lies in a field of study that honestly couldn't be further afield from logic and data, and it is the study of human motivation. So if we go to the next slide. So regardless of the field of psychology, at this point, it's pretty well established that our health, our resilience, and our outlook are far better when we are motivated intrinsically rather than extrinsically. So by intrinsic motivation, I'm referring to those actions that we take because we innately enjoy them and through which we find personal satisfaction, like walking our dog, or I coach my son's athletic sports teams. By extrinsic motivation, I'm referring to actions that we take in order to gain an external reward, like pursuing money or fame. And the science couldn't be clearer on this. To start the positive flywheel moving, to keep it going perpetually, we want to create environments where people are driven intrinsically to act. In our context, that means intrinsically motivating our aviation colleagues to take actions that have a positive environmental impact. Well, as we move to the next slide, there's really good news here around how do we do that. A tremendous amount of research has been done on identifying the conditions that fuel intrinsic motivation. One of the leading frameworks is self-determination theory. In dozens of contexts over the last 50 years, this theory has shown time and time again that optimal well-being and intrinsic motivation flow when three conditions are present. You see them here on the screen. First, when we have autonomy, when we feel that we take actions because we choose to take them. Second, when we have relatedness, when we feel that we belong to a community that we value, and in return, that community values us. Finally, when we feel competent, when we have an understanding of what's expected of us, and we receive feedback that confirms we've mastered those expectations. Now, let's take a look to see how this framework applies to airport operations. For the sake of time, before moving to the next slide, we're going to assume that autonomy is present. Airport operations team members cover a significant amount of distance during their workday. They perform tasks at different workstations. For those that have been in airport operations, it's very rare for the supervisors to follow them around. So while working, our colleagues have a lot of control over their bodies and the actions they take. And so, for the sake of brevity, we're going to assume today that they have autonomy. So with that box checked, let's move to the next slide where we could talk about the second component, which is relatedness. For relatedness to be present here, we need our colleagues to feel like they belong to a community that they value and that values them. To help provide perspective on the causes they value, I think looking at the age demographics of our airport operations colleagues provides some clues. As you can see here, over half of the US airport operations workforce is staffed by members of the millennial and Gen Z generations. These younger generations comprise an even larger percentage of the workforce in emerging aviation markets like Latin America, Asia, and Africa. So how can that help us here? What do members of these two generations both prize? As we turn to the next slide, you'll see fairly quickly, it's environmental advocacy. Amber touched on this at the beginning, and I'm sure this doesn't come as a surprise to most of you, but members of these two generations are focused heavily on environmental sustainability and climate change. These are core values to them. It shapes their behaviors as consumers, and they certainly do as employees. In a recent Fast Company survey, over 70% of millennials said they were more likely to work for a company based on its environmental agenda. Similarly, over 90% of Generation Z believes employers should actively support social and environmental issues. While some could see these viewpoints and this perspective as potential pitfalls for our industry, which again, Amber pointed out at the outset, accounts alone for 2.5% of the world's climate warming problem. In this context, it's oddly quite the opposite. The data shows that a majority of those working in airport operations want to belong to the environmentalist community. They want to seek its acceptance. As such, just like autonomy, we can check the box for relatedness as well within the context of self-determination theory. So this brings us to our final component. It's honestly the most difficult, and until recently was fairly impractical to solve. That component is, of course, competence. If you remember, competence is understanding what's expected of you and receiving feedback that confirms you've met those expectations. While preparing for today, I found this quote on the topic particularly insightful. There is a crippling vagueness about what sustainability means. Again, a crippling vagueness about what sustainability means. And for the longest time, that was true in our industry. People didn't know where to start. The carbon emissions problem was so big that as an airport worker, it was difficult to measurably tie one's actions to any tangible environmental goals. How could I receive feedback that I was meeting sustainability expectations when I didn't even know what those expectations were? Well, thankfully, and this is what Christiaan touched on, the vagueness has faded over the last few years as digital transformation efforts have finally taken hold, yielding reams of data in airport operations. As we move to the next slide, we'll touch on that. And before moving as to how we can connect that data to sustainability, let's just take a closer look at what's available. When structured appropriately, airport operations provide a treasure trove of data. Even your most basic turn of a narrow-body aircraft can involve over 10 teams performing more than 100 discrete tasks over a 45-minute period. For example, performing the FOD walk, chalking the wheels, attaching the jet bridge, and positioning the lab truck. When you factor in the need to positively confirm that the right task was completed by the right person at the right time and at the right location, this data set can easily exceed 1,000 data points. And hopefully most of you looking at this slide as I've been speaking, I think this one will really blow your mind It's a weird one that I've been involved with for over a decade now, but it involves cabin cleaning. Given the number of objects that need to be cleaned on an aircraft and the number of individual cleaning requirements for each object and the common data points that identify who did the cleaning where and when, a single 30-minute cabin cleaning mission alone literally generates 10,000 unique data points. So with that, let's put it all together. So moving on to the second to last slide. With this data, we can begin crafting the SMART goals that affirm competence. And for those of you unfamiliar, when I say SMART, I'm referring to specific, measurable, actionable, realistic, and timely goals. The key to the sequence is providing a templatized collaboration platform. The platform will structure this massive data schema and route the right data points to the right person at the right time via web and mobile applications. This can be viewed in 4 phases that you see on the screen. First is templatization. In advance, operational data is used to build templates that serve as tactical game plans to meet operational needs. For example, based on the aircraft type, the passenger load, and the upline and download stations, a choreographed template will be built for all airport ops team members to execute the aircraft turn. Second is distribution. Day of operation through an intuitive and design-friendly interface, the SMART objectives will be distributed to individual crew members in the form of missions. Each mission includes clear and specific expectations as to what actions each crew member should take. Third is collaboration. While working, the crew will use that same platform to communicate and collaborate real time. As they do, the platform will discreetly and unobtrusively collect data that confirms the SMART goals have been achieved. In parallel, data being generated by sensors will also be fed into the system to confirm individual expectations have been met. The fourth and final phase is reflection. Immediately after missions are completed, the system will provide real-time feedback to individual crew members on how they performed their tasks. As Dan will share in a minute, it also uses nudging strategies to help team members course correct when they fall short of their goals. Okay, so we've now removed the vagueness, right, around sustainability. We're effectively collaborating real time around a complex data set, and 3, we're providing competence affirmation that individual SMART goals are being met. So we're ready finally for the final piece. To intrinsically motivate your airport operations team to take actions that positively impact sustainability, all you need to do is tie a few of the thousands of these data points to the bigger picture goals, right? Did the pushback driver push the aircraft on time? Did the ramp lead hook up the ground power unit within 2 minutes after the aircraft blocked? Did the lav driver properly use a bucket to prevent a hazardous spill on the ramp? And then as you see on the screen, how many bags of recycling did the cabin cleaning team remove from the aircraft? All of these actions help remove or help reduce our carbon footprint. By providing the ability to capture this data and sharing feedback on how these micro actions positively impact the environment, you will effectively close the loop on self-determination theory to drive sustainability forward. Your team will be acting autonomously. They will feel connected and related to a broader community that they value. And they will have tangible proof that they're individual contributors to solving this existential threat that we all face as human beings. And as I promised at the outset, 12 minutes after I started, Jan Willem, through small actions that you already managed in your airport operations today, all of you on this call can help drive big change. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug. And honestly, whenever I see your tech, I always want to spend a couple of days working on the ground. And I heard from some airlines that depending on where you come from, cleaning can maybe sometimes also take a bit longer. All right, cool. Thanks a lot. So last, but as I said, definitely not least, Dan, please go ahead with sustainability through behavior change.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me. So where are we? The 2020s mark a dynamic shift in the business of aviation. Firstly, there's the fallout of COVID, and airlines have got to continue to look to the future, try to determine where they're going to be in 1, 2, or 3 quarters. It's really uncertain right now. And despite this uncertainty, a few things are becoming quite clear, at least for the near term. So we have the apparent success of new vaccines. And sorry, I've got the wrong accent to describe that. The outlook for business travel is very mixed. So consumers are staying closer to home. They're making shorter journeys and they're driving more. And we have passengers that are needing more flexible terms. Cleanliness and social distancing is going to be a priority now in airports. But secondly, there's the need to improve the environmental impact across all industries. And that's being pushed hard by governments and regulators. So the science is really clear. If we don't do this now, we could be faced with economic and social challenges that make COVID look like a walk in the park. And finally, we've got more stress on the people. Tens of thousands of people have lost their jobs, and those remaining are under a lot of pressure. So I'm here to talk about this and argue that operational efficiency is a step forward to alleviating some of these commercial, social, and environmental challenges and doing it really quickly. Next slide, please. So the evidence is really clear. New operational efficiency practices offer the means to tackle those 3 challenges I mentioned earlier. And on top of this, the behavioral change is arguably the quickest and most effective way to achieve this, but we have to do it well. So we've got loads of, so what? We've got loads of analytics platforms that are doing this, but we know despite this information, we're not making more efficient decisions. Next slide, please. So who are we? Who am I talking to you? Many of our team, we come from academia and particularly the field of behavioral economics, which has been touched upon earlier. And without going into too much detail, effectively this means understanding human decision-making and how that affects the irrationality of rational models. So in many industries, for instance, when we control for all external factors that affect performance, we still see huge differences in performance from the most efficient people to the least. And these differences can only be explained by management practices. And also from a behavioral perspective, we know that over 95% of the decisions that we make are unconscious. So we're being pushed and pulled by our environment a lot more than what we think. And behavioral economics applies this science that lies behind these irrational choices, to policies, products, and research. So to Christiaan's point, some of the best data which tells us what decisions are being made is rich now. We're at a point in time where we really are starting to understand these decisions. And some of these decisions are related to energy and fuel. And those data points also happen to tell us about carbon and greenhouse gas emissions and other pollutants that come from those. So the impact on aviation from a behavioral standpoint and a research standpoint is fantastic. And so some of the earliest and most famous experiments and studies in changing behavior are energy and fuel related. So how do we change behavior? Well, I don't want to repeat what Doug said. It was a fantastic presentation, and I'm just going to reiterate and say context is everything. But ultimately, how do we know what works? And using experimentation to evaluate our work, such as randomized control trials, gives us a very rigorous way to move forwards. So for instance, the use of social comparisons to help with household energy use, and I'll show you this in a second, may not be so effective in helping employees in being more efficient. So we have to be very clear and understand what works. Next slide, please. This is an example of how powerful nudges can be. This was a really famous trial, which my co-founder was involved with. It was also with a chap by the name of Richard Thaler from the University of Chicago and the Behavioral Insights team in the UK. If you can find out about this paper, it's called The Behavioralist as a Tax Collector. Effectively, the UK government were trying to collect taxes or unpaid taxes from the public, and they were using behavioral economics or behavioral science to try and increase the propensity to pay. And the example that you see in front of you is the use of a nudge called a social norm. And what we're doing here is effectively comparing people to their community or their peers. And the only difference between those 2 letters is that one sentence: 9 out of people pay their tax on time. The difference in tax collected between those 2 letters was £2.4 million in 23 days. So every single one of those words is worth a fortune. And so the point here is that when you do this right, you can really knock the ball out of the park. It can be very, very powerful. So great, we have a solution. So why don't we apply this to all of our problems? Why don't we compare smokers to each other to stop smoking, or compare politicians to each other to stop wars? I mean, I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but what I do want to say is that this is grounded in context. So as I mentioned earlier, these social comparisons might work in helping people to pay their taxes on time, but they might not be so good in helping people to save fuel in the airport space. Agency is different, and that's where we really need to understand. Next slide, please. So bringing Doug's point, this absolutely has to be personal. We have to design information for the user's preferences, not just the organizations. And this also means making sure that personal data is respected and, where necessary, encrypted. And then, as I mentioned earlier, what about what works? We have to always seek the opportunity to apply experimentation, which is key. Next slide, please. So bringing this background to sustainability, is operational efficiency enough? Well, the short answer is no. As you can see on the graph here, as a carbon reduction solution, for aviation alone, operational efficiency across the whole sector is the red line here, or the red space, only takes a very small slice of the problem. But is it a solution that's ready for now? Yes, it is. And according to the latest IPCC report, we have only till 2030 to miss the first runaway climate change tipping point, which is the 1.5 degree, 2 degrees Celsius global temperature rise. So arguably, operational efficiency is extremely important to address right now for this particular sector. I'd be happy to dig into the environmental side of this in Q&A, but ultimately, behavioral change and operational efficiency offers a low cost and high impact means of achieving these goals. Next slide, please. So for us, and for my organization, this became apparent with a study that our team undertook with Virgin Atlantic in 2014 to 16 with the University of Chicago and London School of Economics. This was the first time randomized control trial in aviation. And I just want to explain here the detail behind how powerful this could be in practice. Airline captains were provided with feedback about their performance against discrete behaviors. This, for reference, was discretionary fuel calculations, actual flight versus planned fuel use, and reduced engine taxi-in. We were measuring all those behaviors, and we were able to provide feedback to captains on the flights that they were operating. We then randomized 335 captains into 4 groups, and with 1 as a control group who received nothing, and the 3 remaining received different contextual changes to their feedback based upon the academic literature. And we sent them letters once a month. And the results were mind-blowing. In 8 months, we saved $6.1 million worth of fuel. And this was the lowest ever abatement cost to reduce carbon in any industry in history. And it gets even better. One of the groups that we were studying, we were using charitable donations. And over the study, we were basically measuring whether or not there was an improvement in job satisfaction. And that group showed improvements in well-being and job satisfaction, which was the same as moving from poor health to excellent health. So armed with this causal evidence for a win-win-win, we had to scale this. So my noble story is, personally, I quit my previous position and threw everything at this. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, we need to move fast, and it would appear that a long-term focus carries risk. As we've seen, there are solutions we've seen today that not only save money, but they save carbon and they improve well-being. 3, being more sustainable makes us more efficient, but it is tough for airlines and airports to decipher what's good and what's not so good. And then finally, what about happiness? These are high-pressure, stressful situations. Can our interventions drive social change as well as commercial and environmental change? Yes, they can. So to conclude, these new solutions can be triple bottom line. They can be low cost, high impact, and a crucial step forward on a low carbon path for aviation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Dan. And I think I've seen this graph now for the 3rd time, but it's still mind blowing with the savings by nudging people into doing the right stuff. So it's brilliant. All right. So we are at the end of the presentations. There is a small poll where we would love to get your feedback, because on our side, we also want to get better every time. So your feedback is highly appreciated. I guess we are then also at the Q&A session. And we already received one question from Mark Porter. How do you balance, and I think that goes out to Chris and Doug, how do you balance the challenge of maintaining employee autonomy with the often uncomfortable truth that the same data can be used to improve operational efficiency at a more granular level, is also inherently linked to individuals more explicitly? So for example, in your example of templatizing operations, how do you ensure this does not cause a reduction in autonomy for employees? Or in the previous camera example from Chris, the feeling that my individual performance could be monitored. So I guess, Doug, maybe you can go first, and then Chris, you can go second.
Yeah, well, first off, Mark, thank you for such thoughtful questions. I think those are the right questions to ask, so I appreciate you asking them. I guess let me bring up the question. Oh, let's see, answer. Cool.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
You moved it on me. So I guess by starting from an autonomy standpoint, I think the overall, for team members to feel that they have autonomy, you obviously can't structure their job too much. And so I'll give you a good example is cabin cleaning. So a lot of the missions that Springshot supports for cleaning involve maybe 1 or 2 tasks. The tasks typically are based on the section of the aircraft being cleaned. So we may have a 5-person crew cleans an aircraft. Maybe someone is responsible for the flight deck and the lavatories. Someone has the galleys, and then the other 3 team members have the seats. And so the task will be clean this section of the aircraft. It isn't clean seat 1, seat 2, seat 3, right? And they don't see tasks that say perform 8 different requirements on that seat. A lot of this is in training before. So when they come to the aircraft, they already know what they need to do. They obviously can use the platform to see if they have questions, specifically what the requirements are. But the goal is you cannot make the team member feel like they're a data collector. I think when mobile technology first sprung on the scene a decade ago, a lot of it was, let's just rush to digital. Let's put flip phones or PDAs, right, in the team members' hands, and let's have them complete lists. They cannot feel like you're collecting data. And so what's critical is the structure, again, try to minimize the tasks. And then to further the sense of autonomy, there's a whole, as Amber and I chatted previously, there's a whole field of study around job crafting. And so someone may have the title of cabin cleaner, but they may feel that it's their responsibility to report maintenance issues, right? Which is somewhat cabin cleaner may be somewhat responsible for that, but that's not their job. But if you provide in the workflow, the ability to, as they go, to quickly snap a photo and quickly tag a broken armrest, right? Or broken tray table, stuff that's not a no-fly item, but these are things that sometimes don't get caught in the logbook. So they're really helpful, but they're things where the cleaner can feel like, I'm crafting my job. I have the autonomy to do more. And I am a maintenance, reporter of items. And so I think the key for autonomy, again, is they can't feel like they're data collectors. You've got to minimize it. And you absolutely have to have an interface that is simple to use, right? There can't be this disconnect between the human and the device that, oh, what's it telling me? And this is a pain to interact with. People need to want to feel the desire to interact with that device and provide data. So I think I at least touched on a part of that. Christiaan, I'll kick it to you on the data side.
Yeah, thanks. I think also excellent question. And maybe before I had sort of 3 things that pop into my mind when I heard the question, but before mentioning them, I think what's interesting that there's also a very big cultural aspect to this. For example, in some Southeast Asian cultures, measuring performance is the most normal thing there is. In any job you will go in Singapore, individuals' performance will be measured, will be publicly displayed versus their peers. And that's something that in some Western cultures is not normal at all, and you won't find there. So first of all, I think you have to have a sort of a cultural sensitive approach to this. But then I think to the topic of autonomy. So the first thing that came into my mind is, I think there's also a way how you introduce something like this, because as long as you involve the people for example, to create the template, then it might not feel as forced upon them as if you just go, this is the template and this is what you need to do. So as long as you keep the overarching goal in mind and involve the people how to get to this goal, I think you can even make something that is probably quite structured feel as something that they're a part of and something that they want to be part of, especially if you look to these younger generations that Doug also presented. Second thing, obviously, this is maybe a bit of a no-brainer, but I would say don't punish but reward. Individual performance measurements that lead to punishment will not be very popular. Obviously, I guess if you're going to reward people for proper behavior, they're going to have much less trouble with being monitored on an individual level. And then the third thing, I don't necessarily even think you need to address people on an individual level. Like if you show, like obviously you want to be able to show people's performance, but you can do it on a shift size, team size kind of groups, right? So there's an optimum, because if you go too big, people say it doesn't matter what I do, I don't see the response of whatever I'm doing in the data or in the results. But if you go to the individual, that might even be too small. So I guess that the trick is also here to find the optimum level where people don't necessarily feel chased individually, but still have an idea that I can see my team is doing well. So those are just, I think, 3 things how we can kind of address that topic. I hope that was
real quick. If I could pick up, Christiaan, on something you shared there, I think, Mark, what's critical is there are different feedback mechanisms. And from a motivation standpoint, if you've got team members that are already intrinsically motivated to do something, don't stack rank them. That's going to deprive them of the autonomy and the joy of doing what they do, right? So studies have showed time and time again that some of the worst feedback systems are ones where you stack rank people. Most famously, Jack Welch in differentiation. If you have 100 people and there's a contest and one person wins, studies show, this probably won't be that off when I say it, but studies show that the most disappointed person isn't number 100. They don't care. It's number 2. The last thing you want to do, right, is, to Christiaan's point, is to disincentivize the individual. So use different feedback systems, badges, XP. Those all work really nice when people are already intrinsically driven to do something. But when it's something where you have to drive an extrinsic reinforcement, Christiaan's right. Even in Western cultures, you may need to stack rank and display performance individual versus individual, but really try to use that sparingly, because it's just been shown not the best motivator long term.
Cool. Thanks, guys. Looking at the amount of questions we're getting in, I would like to move on. Mark, I hope your question has been answered now. Next question is coming from Jim Robinson. He asks if there has been a global index or scorecard been established or will be established so airport management can measure their success over time in achieving sustainability goals, e.g. zero carbon.
Okay, I'll pick up on that one if I may. Thanks for the question, Jim. It's a good one. There's a couple of scorecards around at the moment. So as part of the ACI Airport Carbon Accreditation Programme, there's a tool which is free for airports to download called ACERT, which allows you to measure the emissions and the targets around at airports. And that's proved very popular, and that gets consolidated into all the ACI reporting. Or the other alternative is to look at ISO 14001, which a lot of airports have adopted, which is the international standard for environmental management systems. And that works on targets, goals, and very much on the plan, do, check, act process around continuing improvement. And what's nice about that particularly is it looks at the environmental aspects and impacts. So what you do on a daily basis and what the potential impacts of that are going to be, and it ties into things like risk and opportunity as well. So I hope that answers that question. It's a very quick answer.
Thanks a lot, Amber. Brilliant. So the next question is coming from Charlie Pryor. What percentage of aviation CO2 emissions and other pollution be reduced on the ground? The other way of looking at it is what can realistically be done while we still have ICEs and kerosene? I guess that goes a little bit in your direction again, Amber.
Yeah. Hi, Charlie. Nice to hear from you. It's a big question, and I don't have an immediate answer to it, to be honest. I think a lot of it will depend in which part of the world you're in. So up in the Nordic regions, they've already done a huge amount around reducing emissions on the ground. When you start to look a little bit more globally around things like integrated and intermodal travel systems, you're starting to see big shifts and changings coming through there. I think one of the interesting areas is going to be when you start to look at things like the electrification of aircraft and looking at implementing energy grids into airports, but that's a much bigger infrastructure change. So I think there are opportunities there, but there are provisions that it depends very much on the maturity, the level of adoption, any government or climate corporate taxes. I think there's 64 separate carbon taxes around at the moment, according to the World Bank report. So that will drive changes and shifts as well. So I can't quite answer in terms of a percentage, but there is going to be, I think, a lot that can be done. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
Thank you. The next one goes, the next one is from Sugandhi Jayaraman. How far, and I think, Chris, that goes a bit into your direction, how far are we from integrating a CDM type solution into all ground handling operations so as to ensure energy efficiency and sustainability? Are there examples of something similar being already implemented at any airport?
Excellent question. And it's a topic that we're actually pushing quite heavily for. And it's a bit of a cat and mouse situation or chicken and egg situation, because the anticipated benefits are actually quite significant. However, all the airports, which would be the initiative takers, are kind of looking for the evidence to invest in these kinds of initiatives. So on our side, we are actively lobbying with airports, also with institutions like Eurocontrol, in order to try and get to a point where we can actually start proving these effects to kind of break the chicken and egg problem. I also think that European Horizon 2020 subsidized projects would typically be a good instrument to basically enable these kinds of initiatives that will then show the benefits that will kind of kickstart and create the market for these kind of solutions. So to your question, I don't think it's being done today just yet. I think there's a lot of ideas, concepts, visions around it. We know there's a lot of airports looking into it, considering it. So I think we're pretty close, and it's pretty similar patterns that we've seen with other kinds of, these kinds of developments. So I think one of these days there will be a way where, we'll find a way to get one of these initiatives done. And once the data is there to prove, what kind of benefits will flow from it, I do honestly believe that will sort of kickstart and create a market for these kind of solutions and add-ons to the existing ACDM framework.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And maybe just one sentence. I was part of a IATA working group over the last half year, where we also tried to get into a kind of data standard for aircraft ground handling or turnaround operations. So to create a standard messaging for different stakeholders to exchange information about a ground handling process, but also to define standard denominations and standard terms for ground handling. So to collect them all, that at one stage, and that is maybe the first stage, and then the second or third stage would be to already create like an industry-wide norm or standard for an aircraft turnaround. But thanks, really good question. Next one is Craig Schiller. Recognizing we are talking about an important and immediate means to emissions reduction, what would you want to say to airlines and nations to accelerate the other roughly 90% of aviation's decarbonization? I guess that goes back to Amber.
It's a great question. I think one of the answers is going to be get on with it. You're starting to see at the moment shipping taking great action with some amazing sort of net zero commitments from some of the big shipping companies. You're starting to see power, oil, heavy industries decarbonizing. So if aviation doesn't shift a little bit quicker, suddenly that 2.5% that it represents at the moment of global emissions is going to seem a lot higher as other industries are decarbonizing. So I think one of the key things is going to be look at this as a global industry challenge and really buckle down on the information sharing, looking at that bigger picture and really working together to try and address some of the challenges, particularly as we see this green recovery in this response. And you're starting to see already some of the green recovery requirements from airlines. I've got government stipulations that there must be some environmental aspects put in there. So pay attention.
All right. Nice, thanks.
If I can maybe add one thing to this, I think there are several studies coming out that's also showing paths. How can the aviation industry basically achieve the goals of net zero emissions in 2050? But what I think is very important is that there's sort of a weight portfolio of initiatives, right? Because it's very easy to say in 20 to 30 years, we believe there will be electric flight, or there will be other, still quite uncertain technologies that will mature, and they will give massive improvements. If it all pans out that way, that's great. But I think we'll need to look at the topic and have short-term initiatives as well as long-term initiatives with a spread risk portfolio, a spread time portfolio, where you start doing things today that already make sense, as well as plan for initiatives further down the line as those kind of technologies mature.
Yeah, and I think especially looking at Doug's part and Dan's part in the end, there's technology that can help to factually reduce waste and reduce CO2 emissions, like Christiaan shared, in making turnarounds more efficient and make everyone do the right thing at the right time. But I think also from this whole nudging perspective, it's immediately available. Whereas sustainable aviation fuels, for example, will only be widely available in, 10, 15, 20 years. So I fully agree with you, Chris, that we should have this kind of bouquet of flowers with all different kind of possibilities to reduce. Every single percentage point helps in the end. So Craig, thanks a lot for this great question. There's two more questions. Looking at the time, I would say let's go through them quickly. For everyone else, thanks a lot. If you have other questions, please feel free. Piotr, can you go to the next slide? Please feel free to contact the participants directly. So this question is from Andy Gregg, and I think, Doug, that also goes a little bit into your direction, and maybe Dan, I don't know. Aviation is a complex system with a large number of interrelated but independent external variables. By breaking jobs down into choreographed task lists, you run the risk of removing personal autonomy and hence personal motivation, but also remove the necessary variability to get the task done. If tasks are too prescriptive, there isn't the flexibility to deal with unexpected external constraints. How do you balance this with the use of data to make task flow more efficient?
Jan, want me to start?
Yep.
Cool. Andy, thank you so much. Great question. And thank you for thinking along these lines. I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's finding the balance, right? And the difficulty is we have to structure it somewhat, because you can't have at the aircraft turn a bunch of freelancers. Like, the last thing you want is catering to say, oh, show up whenever I want. The ramp guys, I'll get out there to the aircraft whenever I want. So, for good or bad, there needs to be some structure there. I don't think aviation could exist, airport ops could exist without that. But you're absolutely right as to where do we find the balance. And so when we've partnered with initial companies that have moved to digital transformation, they take the approach often that you're nervous about, right? They want to structure the heck out of everything. Like in the ramp context, it could be, I need to know the time that the backroom personnel first leaves, they meet the aircraft. I need to say that there are 4 runs out to the bin, and it needs to happen at what time. So what could happen is a mission where my job really is to just make sure the bags get offloaded by a certain point, turns into 10 tasks. I'm pulling out my phone, marking that things are done. You're right that is terrible. And so what you really want to do is find the balance. And from a structure standpoint, make sure you establish the minimally required structure points, so that you'll have the structure you need to make sure everything runs on time, but providing the team members with the flexibility to craft their job. And so using this same example, maybe the ramp team members found a way to do the run or to get the offload done with 2 runs, right? Maybe there's something they want to do in the break room to prepare, so they leave 2 minutes after everyone thought for them to meet the initial or do the initial takeoff. You want to provide that team member with the flexibility to document things they found on a FOD walk, things found on arrival on the aircraft, to document a blockout, things that you may want to put structure on, structure their mission so they get all these data points. But the last thing you want to do is do that. You want to give them the autonomy to find those things on their own. But again, make sure that they follow the minimal structure, critical path forward. So very, very, very good question. It's something we all need to be mindful of. You take it the other way, it breaks down the whole system.
Thank you, Doug.
And I'll just add to that. I think there's a clear differentiation here between goals and tasks, or objectives and tasks. So I think being too prescriptive about a task is not the right way to go here. I think setting goals allows that autonomy in order to get to that objective. There are always going to be circumstances where behaviors can't be enacted. There might be ice on the runway. There might be a need for, in the case of pilots, for instance, where they just cannot enact a certain fuel efficiency behavior for safety or geographical or inclement weather or whatever reasons. So with that in mind, I think the first thing is that from our perspective, the data has to take consideration of that and provide the recipient the ability to question the feedback or say, hey, I wasn't able to do this because of A, B, and C. And just making sure that that feedback loop is two-way so that the user is already building part of the feedback for their own personal experience, and making sure that it's goals and not tasks. The tasks can be suggestions rather than orders. Then I think that allows for the autonomy and makes it more fun as well.
Thank you, Dan. Both with the D. All right, then the last question of today, and this goes out to you, Amber, from Vivekanandan. Sorry for mispronouncing that one. This is a specific question to Amber. We are focusing on sustainability and showing level of effort required to achieve long-term targets. What about other side of the equation? How to show an airport is less vulnerable to climate risk?
Thanks. This is a great question. I actually love this because we talk a lot about the impact of aviation on climate change, but what about the impact of climate change on aviation? And it's a very good point to raise. So when you consider changes in temperature, extreme changes, you look at changes in weather pattern, much more forceful winds, which if you happen to be flying are going to make it a lot more turbulent. And I think there was a great report from NASA, not so great if you're a passenger, but it was talking about the increase in passenger related claims for injuries related to turbulence. These are all things you need to consider. At the actual airport level, I think one of the biggest key elements to consider is a really good risk assessment for climate change. So are you in an area where you're likely to have rising sea levels or rising groundwater that might then come up and flood your runways more regularly? Do you need to look at extreme heat and therefore look at smart cooling panels for the airport? Do you look at when and where you put your AC on based on where the sun is? Do you look at potentially having cross-running runways so you can avoid changes in crosswinds? So there's a lot of work that needs to be done if you are running an airport around considering those climate risks. And it can come through as well to do your critical systems. Do you have good backups? Do you have enough power if something goes down? How do you keep people maintained to the airport? There's all sorts of things to consider. But again, I'm a big fan of ISO 14001. And one of the things it looks at is risks associated with climate. So that would be one of the key parts, is to really look at your environmental impacts aspects and apply it to the climate in which your airport is operating. And then to start having some kind of longer term views, working with meteorological societies, and really starting to understand what some of those impacts could be. And being forewarned is being forearmed.
Brilliant. And I guess on these great words, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Amber, Doug, Christiaan, Dan. I think it was a really good webinar. We learned a lot today again. Thank you everyone for participating. It was great to have you here. I saw that in the end, Przemek made it to the webinar again, so you still keep the 100% record. I love that. Thanks everyone. Have a good evening or a good day, and yeah, see you again next month.
Cheers, everyone.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.